Hi, everyone. This is Vipin, and I'm here with Rasanath today.
Hey,
Rasanath, it's been a while since we've recorded something on
it's
our
true.
podcast.
That's right. The two of us, especially.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Likewise.
So, just to jump right into it, you had written a piece, a reflection on the Upbuild blog titled Tolerating Provoking Situations. And I want to dive deeper into that with you.
Okay.
So, first of all, what inspired you to write about tolerating provoking situations?
The first thing that comes to mind as I put myself back at, at the time when I wrote the article, we were, I think we were 2 months into quarantine. This was back in 2020. And I found myself, given the stresses of what everybody was going through, the collective stress, and also the personal individual stress, um, and also recognizing the uncertainty around it, I realized that my day to day life had become what you call provoking. And there was just plenty of that to go around. And I also saw how it was bringing out things in me that I thought did not exist. Uh, you you get squeezed and something comes out of you, which also is an indication of what is stored in you.
Mhm.
And that that was the inspiration behind the piece. The existence of provoking situations on a day-to-day, sometimes like hour-to-hour basis, and then also watching my own reaction, and my own reaction then provoking me even further because me feeling like I'm seeing things about myself that I didn't didn't think existed in me, and not liking myself in the process, and then that just making it just becomes sort of a vicious cycle, and then having to really learn. This is the second part about tolerance. Having to really understand how to tolerate both the situations around me, but also tolerate what I'm seeing in myself and learn how to respond in a way that is more dignified, authentic, and compassionate. All of that requires to create the gap between the provoking situation and your response, which
Hmm.
is what tolerance is.
What were some of the things that you saw in yourself that you're talking about now? Just could you share a couple of examples?
I saw. I have never considered myself to be a caustic person. I've always looked upon myself, and also the world has validated that to quite some extent. A kind, understanding, patient. And what I saw during that time was completely the opposite. Impatience, causticity, sarcasm, passive aggressiveness. And I saw that happening on a daily basis. And we also had, I think, it was 7 months into 8 months into us having our first child. Not being able to sleep at nights was a big cause of it. And people say this, when you don't get sleep, you become a really irritable person. Uh, and at the same time, I didn't think it would happen to me. In the sense, I felt inherently, uh, I was not that kind of a person. Once in a while, when you don't have sleep and you become irritable, that's one thing. But then what I saw was I was becoming somebody, or I had things in me, quite a bit of it, that I didn't think existed. There is an example. I at that time I remember being so snappish with my wife every day and so passive aggressive in my comments. At one point in time, she she just had to like say, hey, what is going on? Your responses are so unkind. And I had to swallow the bitter pill. It was true. She was right.
And you only saw this in yourself in that sort of provoking period of the pandemic in those weeks, because what you're describing also seems like sort of the sort of regular, usual sort of situation or circumstances for most people, that they're having these triggers and this impatience with their partner or their children or their colleague. And so, that's just seems like how the world works. We move through, we have little things, we let them go. Okay, I didn't get enough sleep or something. Like, what is the real impetus for, I mean, it sounds like for you said, hey, this is not how I thought about myself, and these things are happening. And so I want to get back to the person that I think that I actually am.
So two thoughts there. One, I'll address the second thought there before I come to the first one, which is this the norm? What I recognized was that, and this brings us back to provoking situations, right? When you have never been tested,
Yeah.
everything is good. When you've never been challenged that way, everything is fine. Maybe because through your upbringing, through circumstances, and this is not to downplay, gifts and qualities that you have been given, but somehow you've never been tested.
But are you saying that you don't think you were tested before?
I don't think I have been tested in different ways, but this was especially, it is also a stage of life where from a point of view of responsibility, you get really squeezed. Like I'm at the stage of where you have a child, you're running a business, you have aging parents, right? When you're younger, it's all that you have to think about is your life in some ways, right?
I don't know. I would have thought you living in a monastery sleeping on a floor with 20 other monks while you're an investment banker, sleeping four hours a night, would have provided plenty of opportunity for provoking situations.
It was different. It was different because there was a sense, I can say, at that point in time, there was also a sense of like discovery and calling that I was going through. That it was a very interesting and a very, as intense as it was, there was also this excitement of something new and different that was emerging at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So, but this was just very different. There was a sense of like, well, this is going to be life.
Resignation almost.
Yeah, and the dawning of, I would say, in so many ways, a loss of personal freedom.
Mm.
And I've always been a person who has felt like I wanted to be free to pursue what I wanted to pursue. And even in monastic life, when the calling emerged, there was still the sense that yes, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to discover. And at that time in my life, it really dawned on me that my life is not my own anymore. During
the pandemic,
responsibilities. And yeah, I think it was a convergence of a bunch of things, right?
Yeah.
The pandemic, I just added another dimension to it. Children, aging parents, then also the recognition that they're alone and not being able to see them, the stress of, well, who will care for them, and all of that just compounded. And then not being able to sleep, the simplest thing that you have some degree of control on, was a daily reminder of how you have lost control on your life.
Right. So you were saying that you think you might be one way, but really the true test is when when you're tested, when
When
there's
you're
pressure in
tested.
the system. So you could say
Yeah.
you felt like up until that time you weren't really tested. And how do you show up when you were tested? Because when things are when they're relatively easy, that's not your true color showing up.
Yeah, exactly. So, and there have been tests before that.
Yeah.
But this test had a very different
A certain flavor.
flavor to it. Where in the test before, you can always see tests as a challenge. You was like, I'm always up for a challenge. This challenge was completely different. There was no end in sight in some ways. And it's also a challenge that, there are challenges that we say, oh, I really look forward to this challenge. And there are challenges that is not even within our radar. And those are not challenges that we really like necessarily say, oh, I'm looking forward to this kind of challenge. It's a challenge that I don't want. You don't even know that you don't want it, but you just get pushed into it. Mm-hmm. Life does that. And then it keeps you there. And that was what I was experiencing.
And then going back to this first point that you said about what's normal, your usual, common, even.
When that way of interaction becomes normal, you give rise to a collective consciousness that the normal is this is how we interact. I mean, lack of kindness, lack of empathy, lack of essentially not being aware of how I'm showing up. Mm-hmm. And even when I'm triggered and I act in an irritating way or irritable way, I'm passive aggressive, I'm sarcastic. Eventually, it has an effect on myself and my relationships. And we are seeing that as a collective society. We have become a society that can take offenses very quickly. And when you are a society that can take offenses very quickly, then quarrels start. So you don't even necessarily need to have a legitimate reason for why you are in a fight. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's just there all the time because we have lost the tolerance muscle. And so then what to speak about then working through situations that are genuinely complex and require thought, require strength of character. What do we do then, right? When we have never exercised the tolerance muscle on our day-to-day living. Mm-hmm. So yes, it is normal and it's scary that's normal.
Yeah. Well, in your reflection, you wrote, in a culture where rugged individualism and self-expression is strongly encouraged, we've had very limited training on tolerance and patience. And so, I mean, you've already started talking about what happens to the society without these qualities. But what is so important about tolerance?
So many times when we use the word tolerance, it comes across as something passive, that I must just take it. And what I speak about tolerance in the article is that the first level of tolerance that we have to learn to understand is our suffering and learning how to hold our suffering without reacting. That is how that is the most fundamental definition of tolerance. And when we
I want to repeat that for everyone because it's I think quite important. So you're saying the definition of tolerance, or the first stage of tolerance, is to be able to hold our own suffering without reacting.
Yes. Because ultimately, at the end of it all, any external circumstance eventually, or any provoking situation, and we are not going into a conversation of whether the situation is right or wrong, ethically, objectively speaking. But any situation that arises that's provoking is creating suffering in me. And when I don't know how to hold the suffering without reacting to it, typically my reaction will come from a place of lower consciousness, because that's just how our consciousness tends to work.
As a reaction,
as a reaction,
without it being intentional.
That's right.
That's what you mean. Is it coming from a lower consciousness? It's like not fully aware and intending the response, but just almost a habitual reaction.
Exactly. And, I would liken it to something like what a child throwing a tantrum when a child doesn't get something the child wants. Mm-hmm. That is the reaction of the child. And we experience variation of the same reaction that a child would when we react to a provoking situation. I don't like this, and so this is how I am going to react. And that reaction then tends to create more suffering, both for people around us and ourselves. So the capacity to hold the suffering, and then that doesn't mean that we don't respond, but we have to respond, not react. There is a big qualitative difference between the two. Response requires thought, intentionality, and clarity around how the response must be for the benefit. And this is what we talk about, the higher levels of consciousness, the creative consciousness, where I can truly think about the benefit of everybody around me and myself. And to be able to respond that way then requires for me to hold the suffering, to parse through it, to own my part in it, and then respond in a way that either brings understanding or sets healthy boundaries. And sometimes it may require for me to be firm and change the situation around me. But all of that coming from a place of clarity, humility, empathy, and authenticity, where the heart is fully present in that response, takes for us to tolerate our suffering and parse through it, work through it.
Yeah.
And when that doesn't respond, our suffering essentially leaks into our environment. Richard Rohr, who we have quoted before in so many of our podcasts, he talks about in his book, I think it's Falling Upward, he talks about how if we don't transform our suffering, we will inevitably transmit our suffering. And the transformation of suffering, the crucible for the transformation of our suffering is in the container is tolerance.
Yeah.
Because when we don't pour the suffering into the container of tolerance, it won't transform into something that is impactful and powerful both for ourselves and our environment.
Yeah. I have a comment and a question. The comment is, you started this little part of the dialogue with the statement that people sometimes think of tolerance as being passive. And as you describe it, it's so clear how hard it is to tolerate our own suffering or any provocative situation that we're in. And so it's really interesting that it can be perceived as being passive or letting someone walk all over you, when in fact it takes great strength of character to tolerate provoking situation.
It is, and at this stage in my life, it is very clear to me that no transformation happens without tolerance. Zero.
Can you say more about that? I mean, you were talking about how this is the crucible, you have to pour the suffering into it. Say more about that clarity that you have.
Transformation, this ties back to what I said in the earlier part. of the dialogue. Transformation requires us to be able to hold our suffering and really be able to work through it, parse through it. And that means not reacting immediately. Because when we react immediately, we don't hold, right? It just leaks into the environment.
What about the idea that I'm releasing it? So it can fester. If I'm holding it, it'll just fester inside of me. And it's helpful to release some of these.
There is definitely a place for releasing it, because at a certain point in time, holding it makes it hard to go through the transformation process. When many times releasing doesn't help us, the way we release is we just let it out. We transfer. And again, release requires intentionality. Release is not a excuse for just letting it out, lashing out, and then saying, "Okay, I feel good now."
Okay. Can you let's talk? Can you give a concrete example of what this looks like? Like, transform versus transmit. Let's take an example from your life where you were provoked, and what the transmitting looks like, and what transformation.
I have many times, and this only becomes clear how over time in life, you wish you could go back and relive certain moments, and you could do them differently.
Yeah.
There have been times in my life where I have experienced personal shame, sense of failure. These have, there are these big senses of failure where, you failed a project or you failed a test. But I'm talking about failures in terms of how you show up for someone. You are late for a meeting, and you're repeatedly late for a meeting, and then the other person is holding you responsible for it. And I have reacted. And in my reaction, the response is typically, "Hey, why don't you take more responsibility? Do you understand how much responsibility I'm taking here?"
For being on time, or for
meaning for like, I'm overall, like,
overall,
and essentially, do you even realize what an important person I am? And you're making such a big deal out of such a small thing.
Yeah.
And there is just this putting the person in place and releasing the essentially, yes, there is a lot of stress. You are dealing with a lot of things, and you release it on someone who themselves are suffering because you showed up late. And then they are wondering, well, what are they supposed to do at this point? Like, are they simply supposed to accept the fact that you will be late and they shouldn't say anything about it anymore? And I've done that. I've done that quite a few times. I can remember that very clearly. I have also
transformation. Oh, sorry. Look like in that example, you show up late. The person's holding you responsible.
Transformation will. Transformation will be. You have to be able to. You have to be able to hold the shame.
Oh, okay. And can you? What is that? How does it? How do you hold the shame?
You have to acknowledge that you let down this person, that you're actually feeling like a failure in that relationship because you have repeatedly shown up late for the meeting and the person is not feeling supported.
Yeah.
And that means that has a certain, you have an image of how you show up in that relationship, and that image is just being toned down.
Right.
And there is an instantaneous suffering that is getting created. You're not getting, again, it's so simple, right? The ego is not getting the validation that it needs, creates suffering.
Even if it's just this one little tiny slice,
right?
And everything else, like you're saying, you're doing all of this work, you're carrying a huge load, but in this aspect, you feel like you've let someone down, and instead of justifying your lateness, you're saying, wow, yeah, even though I'm doing all of these other things, it doesn't absolve you of the
No, it doesn't.
responsibility for being
Correct.
late, even though that's sort of your natural reaction to say, hey, but look at everything I'm doing. Can you cut me some slack here?
What you are doing is, and you are asking, cut me some slack. But the way you're asking for it,
You're not actually asking
you're not really asking for it,
directly.
right? Like, hey, don't, what you're telling the person is, hey, just understand, even if you can't see certain other parts of my life fully, and you're not necessarily fully privy to how stressful it is. I just want you to know it's an impossible task. You're like putting the other person in a situation where, how will they? Right. Um, but there is an expectation. Also because I don't want to be vulnerable. I because when I express my suffering and I ask for help, there is a way in which it makes me vulnerable,
Yeah.
and it's hard for me to do that. That's an example. And another example of a release is, and this is counter, right? In the name of tolerance, you've just been avoiding, and you're just putting it away. Something provoked you, you're putting it away. You're not addressing it. Neither are you like addressing it internally, nor are you addressing it with the person. You're just putting it away, and it grows and it grows and it grows. And then at one point in time, you explode and you release. And after
Talking about
releasing,
on the other side of that same situation.
yes.
So if
You,
I'm the one who's waiting for you in the meeting over and over and over again, I don't say anything, I don't say anything, I don't say anything. I'm not actually I'm just not addressing it
you're not addressing
to
it.
you externally or within
Right.
me internally, and then one moment you come and I just unleash on you.
Yeah, and you always do this, and what happens is suddenly it's about being late for this meeting, and your entire relationship is now being questioned because things have gone unaddressed.
Right.
They have been put away. They have been avoided. Things have caused irritation, but I don't necessarily look at it. I think that is tolerance,
Right.
but it's not. It's avoidance, right? I just put things away, and then suddenly they don't go away,
Right.
and then it explodes. And then after I release, I've said everything. I feel like, okay, I think we are back to normal.
But the other person is carrying the wound from that.
The other person is like, what just happened?
Yeah.
And I have been on the other side of it too, where I've had people who, stick at the phone, and I had, one person call me a power monger and, neglectful of the relationship, and, so many names. And it shocked me because I was like, what what just happened? And then afterwards, the person was like, okay, everything is fine. We're back to normal. Until date, that conversation, like the relationship was never the same for me because I have never gotten an opportunity to address it because the other person is just not willing to.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm like, for me, that happened in 2012. And I'm still left with like, the relationship has never been the same for me.
Yeah.
But the other person has moved on. Right. And I am left to resolve the unresolved parts of it.
Yeah.
And the other person has said what they needed to say. They have said their piece and they've moved on. But we've never really gotten a chance to like fully understand what happened.
What's the line here? Because I would imagine if you and I were meeting and you were late, like I would just say I wouldn't say anything. It wouldn't be that big of a deal. And then like maybe that happens multiple times. Especially in work settings where you do want to let things go. It's not like what's the line between hey, I've been avoiding this thing and it's been unaddressed and now it's coming on really strong versus, like, oh, every little thing that's happening, hey, we should talk about this. Like that would get very tiresome.
Yeah, it's true. And then before I directly answer the question around what is the line, just stepping back and really understanding, going back to that image where when you tolerate,
Yeah.
when you pour your suffering into the crucible, it creates perspective. If you have to really process, you have to understand what happened in the context of the entire relationship.
Mm-hmm.
In the context of what you know about the person and perhaps what you don't know about the person. And that context is so critical in terms of what meaning we make out of that suffering. And what I have recognized time and again when I have learned how to tolerate and process is that there are things that I know for sure. And there are many things that I don't know. All that I know is I'm experiencing something, but I don't know what the actual cause is. And it makes me come into the conversation with curiosity, and this is the basis of nonviolent communication, right? Where you talk about, well, this is what I'm experiencing, but I'm not concluding why this is happening. I'm not character assassinating. I'm not blaming. Right? I come into the conversation saying, hey, what I've noticed is every time you're 5-10 minutes late, and I am waiting at that time, and I would love to use that time somewhere else, right? And I'm wondering if we should move our time 10-15 minutes later so that it gives you time to do what you want to do. There is a way in which that can be addressed without blame.
That can seem passive aggressive too, though. It's like, hey, I've noticed you're 5-10 minutes late. Would you like to move our time 10 minutes so that,
passive aggressiveness is a tone where the irritability actually comes out without it necessarily too confronting. Then there might be genuine, and again, that's why I said in the context of the relationship, when you know more about the other person,
right,
there is a way in which you understand, what, this is not this person's, this is probably not happening intentionally.
Yeah.
But then it's also important to bring attention to something that doesn't go.
Not working.
It's not working.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I really appreciate what you're saying about tolerance opening us up to what other stories are possible. Because when we react, we're reacting on our single story that we have, that we're telling ourselves. And it's obviously it's very limited in terms of scope of full understanding, but it helps us justify our reaction.
Right. And there is a time where, and this is the other side of it, where you have tolerated, you have processed, you're responding, and the other person just doesn't have the capacity to meet you.
Mm-hmm.
And that also, then there is also a place where you have to set a boundary, where simply tolerating and taking more of the same is only creating suffering for both.
Yeah.
Right. So, but then coming to that place and applying that boundary with intentionality and with compassion, with the desire that the other person hopefully will wake up to with the loss of with the boundary, then the person can then wake up to the fact that I am losing something here, and I have to look at myself. That is also an important part of tolerance. So tolerance just doesn't mean we keep taking, but tolerance does mean that when we do apply the boundary, it comes with clarity, intentionality, and from a place of waking the other person up to what they have not been taking responsibility for. But that does require for us to own our part and do our best.
Yeah. So what does it take to practice tolerance?
This will connect with your piece around stimulus and response.
Yeah.
And that is exactly what it is. Press pause. You need to have a pause button when I'm experiencing some form of trigger. The trigger is an indication of personal suffering. Something happened. Something was violated. I'm experiencing guilt, shame, on a deeper level. I'm feeling not understood. There are so many things that can happen.
Yeah.
And when there is a stimulus, the first thing that we need to do is create a pause before we respond.
Yeah.
That pause is essentially tolerance.
Right. The reactions can come so fast.
Yes.
That it's very hard. And that was what I was writing about, is how challenging it is to intercept the space between that stimulus and the response. It often feels like there's no daylight in there at all. So how does one start to find the pause button?
Many times when we are first starting the practice of tolerance, and I should say there is no limit to our entire life is a practice around tolerance. When we first start doing it, even we may react, but when we find ourselves in the middle of the reaction, it's important to press pause button and say, you know what, I have been reactive right now. I need some time.
Yeah. So you're saying you can even reverse. Even if you run the red light and you're in the middle of the intersection, you can actually, even at that point,
stop, reverse, reverse.
And even if there's a lot of shame there, you may feel it, because sometimes it's easier to just run through the intersection, let it pass, and then just maybe come back later. But catching yourself in the middle of the intersection and then to pull back and say, hey, I'm really sorry, I need some time to process.
And many times that's when we truly take responsibility, and we have to do it again and again and again. And as you said, there might be more shame involved in it. But that shame is a corrective shame, hopefully, where it is, and this is not about shaming someone. That the shame, as I understand, there are many emotions that are actually correcting the course of our consciousness and our actions. And in this case, when we really understand the shame of running the light, hopefully it helps us understand, okay, I have to press the pause button earlier next time.
I don't want to find myself in the middle of the intersection.
And I don't have to find myself in the middle of the intersection. Like, there is a lesson here. And through that lesson, hopefully, we can, this is typically what happens. We run the light several times, we keep doing it. And then when we learn our lesson repeatedly, okay, I have to press pause, then we start catching ourselves as we are doing it. So we don't run the light so far. We're just like there, and we have to brake suddenly in front of the red light. And then when we learn to do that repeatedly over time, then we learn to slow down even before the red light
Yeah.
comes on.
It's similar to children, as you described earlier. You can start to see how do you start to notice the body language and the agitation well in advance so that you can intercede
That's
before the tantrum
Yes,
happens.
yes. And there are clear signs, right? Like that is exactly what we are also learning with our toddler. Is okay. We know exactly where this is going. We have to intercept. And so there is a way in which you have to connect in order to make the interception happen. And that connection is so crucial. But when we don't create this, when we don't recognize the patterns, when we're not aware of the patterns, when we are, and this is many times, that's why going back to what you said very early on in the conversation, when that starts to become the norm, right? We just react this way and then we continue on with life.
Yeah.
We just don't learn how to intercept
Ourselves.
Yeah.
Well, I was also thinking that another pattern that I've seen in myself and in others is if I run I run the red light, I run through the intersection, and then sort of you let time heal, or you're in relationships where there are no real consequences. That's the thing of that kind of behavior. That could be, parent child, spouses, us with our parents,
Right.
etc. And so you keep running through the light, and if there are no consequences, it's hard to even ever, why pause? It's just like I run through, and there's sort of tacit forgiveness on the other side, and then there's kind of, okay, it's just a pattern that keeps repeating itself, and it's kind of just the state that we're in. So the other person chalks it up to, oh yeah, this is this person just being them and running through the light again, and nothing ever happens.
There are always consequences. Those consequences may not be, you will see in relationships, for example, there may not be immediate consequences. Over time, it takes its toll.
Yeah.
And then at that time, when the time is quote unquote right, it's the demise of the relationship. And there's just no going back at that point in time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? It becomes too big to repair. And this is this is our collective society, really.
That's really powerful, Rasanath. That's really hitting me. I'm thinking of a couple of relationships in particular where I can see, you think we're so short-term oriented that we let it fly, let it fly, let it fly. But over time, what's the state of that relationship,
And, it's it's interesting. It may also become evident to us that I probably didn't care much about the relationship.
You're saying I probably didn't
care much about the relationship. I was okay with it falling apart in time as long as I could squeeze out everything I could from the relationship. This is the
very selfish orientation.
It is.
Yeah.
And when I have become okay with that norm of being, it's only a matter of time before that just becomes the collective consciousness of my environment.
I also think that you can be in the situation where at a long, in the long run, you're seeing the state of the relationship and it feels irreparable at that point. And then, not only can you look at it and say, I don't even know how to fix this, but you don't have the tolerance actually to to stay in it. And so at that point, you just like kind of, brush your hands and like, well,
and start new, right?
yeah, I can't really do anything about this. And in fact, you may not even see it as your responsibility. It's just, we've kind of grown apart and all of these things have happened, but you're not really taking, it's been such a long time and you're not taking you've never taken responsibility for your impact on the other person.
And if we were to really look at our lives from that perspective, we will also begin to see how easy it is for us to objectify every relationship where I make use of it.
What's in it for me?
What's in it for me? And when it ends, I just want to start fresh without like really. And sometimes, yes, it's hard to repair certain relationships. But you know what? When I have really learned my lesson, the relationship is not dead. It's amazing how powerful it can be. When I have learned my lesson, um, I live in this place of remorse, where one is I bring the lessons to all my other relationships, but I'm also always waiting for an opportunity where I can actually repair that relationship. I never close the door on it. I'm just saying, if and when I get the opportunity, when there is readiness, when the time is right, I want to acknowledge my part. And maybe the relationship will never be restored. But what I have done is stopped objectifying that relationship and taken responsibility for my share of it, or for my contribution to what let the relationship fall by the wayside.
I think we need to have an entirely separate conversation about objectification in relationships.
It's a rich topic.
It is, because there's that sounds very violent when we talk about objectification, but what you're talking about is so commonplace, and it can be the objectifying the relationship and the other person can be, I mean, there's a whole spectrum from what's seemingly benign to
to using someone. There is a whole spectrum.
But I think it's even helpful understanding the benign, like how am I approaching all of the relationships in my life, and is it from an objective or a subjective place?
And I can say with honesty, and it's embarrassing to admit it, but when I look back at my life, I see very clearly, and I was sharing this with Hari Prasad, 99% of my relationships, even what I call the deep relationships, have benign elements of objectification, where the orientation of the relationship, I have never really truly learned to serve the other. I've never really truly learned to love. The reason why tolerance is such a big part in the recognition of that is when we don't tolerate, we don't see how we contribute. When we don't see how we contribute, we can never really take full responsibility. When we can't take full responsibility, we will never really learn how to love.
Wow.
And I don't think it's an option.
Yeah. This all of a sudden sounds much bigger than tolerance.
Tolerance is, that's why I said early on, tolerance is the foundation of transformation.
Yeah.
And what we talked about is the transformation process.
Yeah.
Right, where a responsibility leads to humility. When humility comes, then we learn how to love.
Mhm.
But the foundation of all of that is, and in any spiritual tradition, especially like the tradition that I've been practicing, I've never really understood. There is a foundational verse in our practice, which goes. The Sanskrit is Trinad api sunichena taror iva sahishnuna amani namanadena kirtaniya sadahari. The idea being that one must be as tolerant. Sahishnuna in Sanskrit means the capacity to tolerate, like a tree. And it seemed very, again, as I said, passive, an ideal that uh, only saints can live. But this verse happens to be the foundation of spiritual practice in our tradition. I'm only recognizing over time, and my teacher, my guru, quotes this verse again and again and again. For 26 years, I have heard him quote this verse in 95% of his classes. You always come down to this verse.
Wow, 95% of his classes.
And I can easily say this is the mission statement of his life. And it's only now, after years of repeatedly listening to it, I recognize why it is so foundational. It's because when we don't tolerate, it doesn't even create the chance for transformation. There is no chance. And so if we are aspiring for transformation, what to speak of spiritual transformation, we have to develop the quality of tolerance. And socially speaking, what we are experiencing globally and in this country, where is this being taught? That we have become a culture that is so easily offended and doesn't know how to process constructively, healthily, so that it leads to outcomes that are uplifting.
Wow. This conversation has inspired me much more than I was imagining. It always does, but I never know from where and how. And I think the thing that is particularly striking me is just, the relationship between tolerance and love. And what you said about just thinking about our relationships, and when do I treat people as objects to be used versus subjects to be served, and how tolerance is impacting those relationships at the fundamental unit level. And I know that you're not in need of my affirmation here, but I can say to you that I know you said if you look at 99% of your relationships, you can see the objectification there, even if it may be benign in different ways. As someone who has been in relationship with you for the last 10 years, I've only felt you're approaching this relationship from a place of deep service and seeing me as a subject and not an object in any way.
Thank you. I think, and again, this is only something that I'm discovering more and more, that I have done service more as duty than as love. I have, because when I serve, there's still a validation that comes for the sense of self, of like this person really loves to serve, versus the quality of how service comes when it comes from a place of love. What I know clearly now is that I don't know what that feels like. And in that sense of the term, I feel like I have still not fully shown up selflessly. And while there are parts of it that are selfless, it still doesn't have the quality of, as you said, like true service.
Yeah. Now I understand, actually, when you put it that way. I wonder if I've ever done anything selflessly in my life. I don't even know. I don't even know what that could look like. So I understand, and I'm inspired to follow you in this journey, and see what I can learn as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rasanath. Thank you for this conversation. I feel a renewed, maybe renewed is not the right word, but I feel real inspiration to hit the pause button much more, thinking long term about my relationships and the character that I'm cultivating. And even if I end up in the middle of the intersection sometimes, to take your prompt to reverse out and take responsibility for the lack of tolerance.
The one reason I just wanted to say why this is so important, the one reason why tolerance as a virtue is not necessarily so appreciated, because there is nothing sexy about it. It will not even be noticed.
You're saying you don't get much validation.
You don't get much validation. It's like
Anti-validation.
Anti-validation. It's also, you're like, it's like, it's like weeding. It's like you're in the muck of things.
Yeah.
Right. And then to relentlessly, time and again, do that. There is nothing glamorous really about that. But what it does foundationally to who we are as individuals, I don't think anything else can do it.
Yeah. Well, how will the flowers bloom if their garden is full of weeds? So,
Right.
Yeah, I hear you. So
we look at the flowers and we say, oh, that's a flower that looks so nice, but it takes what it takes to garden, that's just not visible.
Okay. Well, we will close on that note, and I will raise a toast to weeding our gardens. And I'm glad to be in the garden with you so that we can do that work together.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
I
Ross.
really appreciate it.